All right, everybody. Very happy today to have a guest on the program, Dr. Nathan Jenkins. Thanks for being here, brother. We appreciate it.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me.
And give everybody just a little background on who you are and what you're all about. You did earn your PhD in exercise physiology. You've been a CrossFitter since 2015, training at your affiliate since 2018. You hold a level 2 CrossFit training credential. You were a professor at the University of Georgia for 9 years, where you directed a research program focused on the health benefits of exercise and nutrition. And since then, left academia, joined up with RP Strength 2017, and now you're really focused on helping people through the nutrition side of the house. Is that pretty fair synopsis?
Yeah, that's plenty. Thanks, man. Yeah, we don't have to go into the whole story, but that's the gist of where I'm at these days.
Well, we're gonna, this is gonna be hopefully bringing somebody well-credentialed from the land of exercise science in and chatting about what that world's all about, what the strength and conditioning and CrossFit world's all about, how the two can benefit from one another, where maybe things have kind of gone too far. But before we even get into that, I'll let you know from the nutrition side of the house, since that's something that you're focusing on. In the oven in my home right now is a loaf of banana bread that my wife has cooked up from the old bananas that were about to go a bit too far on the counter. And when it comes out of the oven, whatever it is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a serving. And by the time that tomorrow morning comes, there's a low chance that there'll be any banana bread in the Sherwood household. So I'm crushing the nutrition side of the house, just so you know.
Oh my God, that makes me, I was thinking about that the other day. I also, I have a 9-month-old son, and
so you're busy.
Well, yeah, for sure. But he's just starting to eat bananas, and I was looking at, and among other, soft, mushy things like that.
Yeah.
And I was looking at, some of the bananas are starting to go a little bit bad. And I was like, oh, those are looking perfect for banana bread.
Oh.
So that's the second time. I haven't thought about banana bread in years, but the second time in 3 days that banana bread
sign.
I got to make some banana.
I mean, I think you have to do it now.
The universe is telling me, I think this weekend it's going to happen.
Absolutely. It's a sign. But all right, sorry for the already
That's okay.
A rabbit hole there. But I've got a lot of scattered thoughts on where I wanted to go with this. My compadre was a lot more organized with his decision. and Boz, you had a good place to start, so why don't you kick it off?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for being here, Dr. Jenkins. You'll always be Dr. Jenkins in my heart. So I guess what I think is so interesting about your story is, I'm curious to know, and I think it'd be valuable for the listeners to know what drew you to CrossFit in the first place. And especially in the face of, so many academics, they seem to have a really polarized view of CrossFit, and Pat and I actually just did a show. I can't remember if it's released already or if it's upcoming, but basically it was kind of on the controversies that seem to continue to follow CrossFit around and what people kind of stigmatized about it. So number one, how did you get drawn into it? And number two, what kept you here?
Yeah, well, first I'll say thank you guys once again for having me on. I listened to your show. I think that was the one. I think that was the one that was titled like "What does CrossFit do wrong?" or what are all the wrong things about CrossFit? And yeah, man, it resonated a lot because I would say I was one of those people initially. One of those academics in particular that's like very skeptical. And I think that's part of our training is to be skeptical initially of a lot of things. I think it's a healthy thing and a good thing. But,
well, there's a lot of fluff out there. So usually skepticism will be your ally.
It's a fad, this is just another fad is what my initial, knee-jerk reaction is what it was to CrossFit. When I first came across it when I was in grad school and I went to grad school it was like 2007 to 2011 is when I was working on my PhD. And I remember doing some experiments at that time. Some people there was a couple guys who volunteered for our studies, and we get a little bit of intake for our studies, get some, fill out questionnaires and get some background on them. And I remember it was like 2008 or so. A guy said, I don't really run. I don't really lift per se, but I do this thing called CrossFit. And I was like, huh? That may be a little late, a little early. I don't know, but that was my first memory of seeing the term. And I thought it was weird, but then I do remember that guy for somebody who said he doesn't do much running, had a crazy VO2 max on the treadmill. So that that's a memory that kind of stuck with me a little bit, but then still pretty dismissive of it. Didn't really pay much attention to it. I'm going to fast forward. There's some other previous or brief exposures to it along the way. But the next time I really like personally thought about it a lot was must have been 2013 or 2014. I was teaching at University of Georgia by this time, and I was teaching an ex-phys class. And in there was a section towards in the latter third of the semester where I did a little segment on trends and controversies in fitness and health. And naturally, CrossFit came up, and it was really student driven. Like, what did the students want to talk about? And there were a couple, two female students who were level 1 coaches at a local affiliate, and they came up after. It was the day we talked about CrossFit, and I set these debates up as like, hey, here's one side, here's the other side. It was really cool. The students I would assign them to they didn't get to pick their own side, but they had to take the pro and the con and all this stuff. It was pretty cool. And we did this whole thing and tried to be pretty balanced about it. And it was through that I actually personally learned a lot, as you do when you do an exercise like that. And I remember, I guess, a couple things. One is there was a lot that even though I was dismissed, like initially I was like, yeah, CrossFit, that's the thing where the guys flip the tires and climb the ropes and hurt themselves.
Right. That's a great description.
Right. And but there's a lot to like. The emphasis on intensity over volume is something that was very, very, it holds up very well, and it's very consistent with the take home messages from a lot of like really classic exercise science, exercise physiology literature, going back to like the 50s and 60s, or even before that. There's the classic studies on like interval training and how that really produces the sort of of all the variables of the training stimulus, the intensity seems to be the one that gives you the biggest bang for the buck. That's something that CrossFit teaches and it holds up in the scientific literature. So that was cool. I really like that. And then the accessibility for just the average gym goer to these functional movements that I hadn't really seen before in any other fitness setting. So, like for example, in the traditional Globo gym that I grew up into in the late 90s, doing bicep curls and in the squat rack in front of the mirror. We weren't doing. I'd touched a barbell thousands of times in my life, but I had never done a clean or a snatch or had any exposure to those things. So I liked those things, and so it was after that discussion in class that day, students came up to me and kind of like asked me. I can't remember now exactly what questions they asked me, but I had a really interesting discussion with those kids, and that kind of planted a seed. Maybe I should just try this. I have a background in mountain bike racing from like college, and I had been since that time all through grad school and everything. I had really been missing that intensity from my life. By the way, I think it was Boz. You were talking about mountain biking on a recent episode, and I think you made the point. It's like, hey, what is the credential? The credential necessary to be a mountain bike instructor.
Yeah.
Fun fact. Okay, I'm going to take a quick little rabbit hole. I was actually a mountain bike instructor for 3 months at one time, and my credentials for that were simply that I like to ride bikes. That was it.
Bam. There it is. My hunch was correct.
Yeah. To close the loop on that conversation, there was no vetting. It was that I was a nice person. I was working with kids, so I think I passed the criminal background check, and I really like to ride bikes.
That's a bonus.
I could work on them a little bit. And
you weren't a criminal, and you owned a mountain bike. You're hired.
Yeah. And I really like to ride bikes. But oh my gosh! And then it was super stressful. I had to drive. I was 21 years old, driving this van full of 11 and 12-year-old summer camp kids with a bike trailer with 10 bikes on it on the back. I had never driven I know, like through these windy roads in North Carolina. They really should have vetted me a little bit better because I was not qualified to do that. Anyway, I love it. So mountain biking. I was missing that intensity in my life, and I was like, for a lot of reasons, I was thinking about CrossFit. I contemplated it for about 6 months, and that's kind of my test to see if something's like a passing interest for me or something I really want to do. Whether it's if I think about it for more than 3 to 6 months, if I'm still thinking about it, then I need to just do it. So that's how cool. I started CrossFit. That's how I actually bought a bike again in 2018. I got back into mountain biking. That's how I spent a lot of money on a grill that I grill meats on all the time now. That's just basically how I make decisions. So anyway, that's how I got into it. That was 2015. I said, I'm going to try CrossFit for a year. And it stuck. It's completely transformed. First of all, my fitness, my health, my body composition, pretty much all those things. And about the first 6 to 8 months, I would say, is when it's raining PRs in the beginning. You're having those beginner gains, and eventually it transformed literally everything in my life. I met my wife there at that first gym that we were at. We're married now for 5 years and have a baby. It completely CrossFit infiltrated its way into my research program at the university. It was through that I ended up reaching out. How I got into the nutrition thing is a longer story, but to get more dialed in nutrition, I became a customer of RP Strength. Just mention that real quick, and then reached out to Nick Shaw, the CEO, and became a coach with them. First became a side thing, but now that's my full time and only job. So completely transformed everything for me. So,
wow.
Yeah, that's
you're both feet in the deep end.
But yeah, like head completely submerged in the deep end.
Try to stay on track with where you want to go, because I'm about to turn the wheel for a second.
That's fine.
Okay.
Because there's a couple things you said, Nathan, that are so interesting, and potentially we would have got into them later on, but I think they're relevant because you just mentioned them. So how is it, I'm paraphrasing what you said, that you heard about CrossFit a little bit through this group discussion. One of the things that did resonate with you and you felt was fact-based and supported by, you said, I believe, decades of literature, was the importance of intensity. So that seems like it was a very well-known fact. Yet no one in the world was exercising with intensity. So that's a very bizarre bifurcation to me, that it was so well known in academia for decades, yet it wasn't being applied. How in the world does that happen? And then even, I'm not calling you out, but it's an interesting deal that even you yourself, working in academia, more intimately familiar with the literature than most people, said that when you got involved with CrossFit, you kind of started because you were missing some intensity in your life. So even you knew about it and it wasn't in your regime. Where do you think that separation occurred?
It's a super interesting point, and it's a thing that less so in the last 6 months, because I haven't been in the university setting every day, but still things that are like, it's this juxtaposition that I just don't really understand, which is what. Well, okay, let me see if I can unpack it this way. Here's how I think it can kind of make sense, is that when you look at there's different sort of silos or different schools of thought, philosophies, even within exercise physiology. There's the classic experimentalist exercise physiologist that's doing the discovery science to determine, like back in the day, it's like, let's tinker with these different variables of the training stimulus to see which one produces the greatest adaptation. Usually the exercise protocol was some sort of endurance model.
I was going to say, are they tinkering blindly or tinkering based upon something they've observed in nature?
Systematically, with things like, and I'm thinking of a couple different graphs in my mind. This is that's like what my memory bank is like flashcards of different data slides and stuff. But like, there's several studies of this, but the classic depiction is, okay, let's have different study subjects train harder, but increase the intensity, but have the volume stay low, or increase the volume but reduce the intensity, such that overall work output is the same. So matching for total energy expenditure. And usually the outcome variable in these studies is VO2 max, or maybe some sort of endurance performance metric. And usually the modality is running or cycling or something that's easy to control in a lab setting. So that's one kind of thing to keep in mind with all of this, is that the literature is very, for lack of a better term, biased towards the endurance modality, because it's kind of easy. It's easy to control. We don't know a lot. We don't know a lot about how this applies to different movements and different implements and that sort of thing. That's where CrossFit kind of broke a lot of molds. But okay, so again, it's been worked out that basically the higher the intensity, in theory, and not just in theory, but empirically observed, it's been shown that the higher the intensity, the more the adaptation. It's pretty much dose dependent. The greater the intensity, the greater the adaptation. Now, so it's the folks who did those experiments And by the way, that holds up at the whole body level, like the cellular, mitochondrial level, all of that. It's been very well documented in some really elegant studies, all the way from like cellular kind of, rodent model studies to whole body human studies. It's really robust. No one that has any understanding of this literature would really argue with that. However, the public health application side of the exercise science, exercise physiology field takes a different approach. And also, this is where a little bit of the psychology gets into it too. And I'd have to think about who I'd recommend to have you guys talk to about this, because I don't really live in that world. It's not anymore, especially, but and I didn't really dabble. But like this whole phenomenon of exercise adherence to a training program is traditionally written is abysmal.
Right.
So that's part one. And part two is like there's this, and just public health or health research in general. I don't know if we borrowed this from the medical community with like pharmacology stuff, but there's this idea of the minimum effective dose. And so a big thrust of the public health oriented research to like try to get people to move more and become healthier is like, what's the least we can tell them to do so that they just do something?
I believe that. That makes sense to me.
It does. Go ahead, Rob.
I'd love to offer a lay person's observation in there too, which is I really think that somewhere along the line there became this hard line between athlete and everybody else.
Yep.
And in many cases, I think, people will look at this accepted observed phenomena that intensity does seem to drive results, but that's for athletes, and athletes are the ones that can partake in that, and they're the population that will, of course, do that. But everybody else, that's not going to work for them for various reasons, like you said, that are much softer. It's adherence. It's something that's too hard for them. They're not going to be accustomed to this kind of training. Ergo, it doesn't apply. That seems to be what I've seen.
You're exactly right. That is the thing. Like if in the conversations I would have with former colleagues and stuff, that's exactly right. Those studies were done in athletes. Well, a lot of them were, and a lot of the stuff was, I can think of some that were done actually like at the Olympic Training Center and stuff. But a lot of them were done in, I guess we would call it like the masters population, but just, older but healthy individuals. My PhD advisor during his postdoc was running studies of, in what they called at the time, the geriatric unit. I don't think that's the term that they use anymore. But at Washington University in St. Louis, and he was absolutely running these folks, these older guys and ladies through the ringer, doing one really cool study was 5 minutes of maximum effort. Basically 5 minutes of work at VO2 max. I believe the rest periods were, I'd have to go back and look. It's somewhere 2 to 5 minutes. Call it a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. Do that for 5 times. That was the training protocol. And then every week or two throughout the study, they would retest the VO2 max so that they could continue to increase the absolute work output as they got fitter. And essentially, there was a linear increase in the VO2 max throughout this. I want to say it was a 8 or 10 week study, up to the point where their VO2s were. These are just previously sedentary folks. VO2s were at the level of considered to be like athletic or at least recreationally trained athletes.
Wow.
So it was phenomenal.
The funny thing is that it works, but like you're saying, those people had the compliance of somebody standing there staring at them with a clipboard 100%. On the bike. You're going to be here next week. And I bet if it was an 8-week study, on week 9, they didn't do that on their own.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that
that's true.
The split that seems to happen between this idea of athlete versus everybody else, which thankfully I believe CrossFit's done a lot to erode that, right? Like we treat everybody.
Oh yeah.
It's like, hey man, you may not be a person who's competitive or looking to do this full time or whatever, but at the same time, we're all going to be athletes in the sense that we're pursuing something that is goal driven and results based, et cetera. But it seems like there's this weird disconnect. It's like, okay, it's accepted that this is going to work for athletes, but somehow there's a different physiology present for the average person. It's like, how does that work? It doesn't.
I don't know, man. Strange. Yeah, to me, and maybe it's because I've worked, in the lab setting with all the full spectrum, but you can really appreciate how there's huge differences. Obviously, like you work with a lead athlete, you appreciate that there's sort of the specimen. It's amazing. Yep. But at the same time, you work with the older, the chronic disease population, and you can see the similarity. We're all just people, right? And it's the same physiology. It's the same fundamental physiology. We all have the same, same basic needs.
Well, and it's funny too, because with low intensity versus high intensity, and the higher you get with intensity, that's, distinctly, or I should say quite related to discomfort. It takes a unique individual to go out and voluntarily expose themselves to high levels of discomfort on a regular basis, which is why CrossFitters are a good kind of crazy. And the community aspect helps through a positive form of peer pressure to increase compliance and whatnot, because taking the same activity, running, but listen, if you take one with a low intensity, you have much higher compliance. Hey, who wants to go? Now, I know CrossFitters hate running, so maybe this is a terrible example. Hey, who wants to go for a 30-minute jog? You're going to get plenty of hands go up. Hey, who wants to go to the track for some 400-meter repeats? No hands go up.
400, 800.
And if you go do a 30-minute jog, nobody asks you any crazy questions. You're running. If you are at the track doing 6 400-meter repeats, somebody will go, "Hey, what are you training for?
What are you doing?"
So, well, you must be an athlete. Like, why are you doing this crazy thing? It's like, well, because intensity is a really good thing.
Well,
it's a really good thing.
Let me steer things just a little bit on the opposite end. So I think it's really cool that, intensity seems to be something that's pretty accepted, even if it's not, up until very recently, been kind of injected into the mainstream culture. At least it's well documented that that's a good thing. And, we talk about this at the level 1 a lot, how there's kind of 3 fundamental pieces to what makes up CrossFit. There's functional movements, there's intensity, and then there's variance. And most people that I've encountered, from an academic background, you talk to them about intensity, they're like, okay, I get it. You talk to them about functional movements and you explain the utility of that, and they're like, yep, makes a lot of sense to me. And then you get to the part about variance, and that's where you start to see the hands go up and they start backing away slowly because they can't quite wrap their head around the breadth that CrossFit intentionally is after. So how did you overcome that? And what was it about variance that either A, you were a little bit skeptical about at first, and B, kind of, you later kind of warmed up to? How did you overcome that hurdle of accepting variance as a viable element of the training?
I think variance, or the degree of variance, ranging from quite a lot, like CrossFit. In fact, it seems like you guys, I would defer to you guys for this, but my interpretation is almost like the more the better. Although, of course, not to the point of being random. It's not the name of this podcast, right? You don't want to be random,
right? That's right.
But there's even within, like, you have really, really, really wide constraints for how much you change stuff. And Pat, I really actually appreciated your. It was both you guys, but the 2-part discussion on programming and how you introduce variance and how that is a key component in there. I think it depends on the goal of the program. And so for CrossFit, it's a GPP program. The variance in programming produces a generalized adaptation. And if that's what you're after, then that's what you want. For where there's a rub with the academic community, and this is how we're trained. This is our I can think of a few different examples, like in textbooks, even anything from a basic XPhys textbook to more focused textbooks on, like, you take a programming class, and sorry, my cat likes to hang out with me. And every time I do a podcast or a Zoom call, she's poking her face into the screen.
She likes the camera.
She does. She's usually pretty shy whenever we have people over, but whenever it's something about the computer. So for example, where I've had interesting conversations with this, even some of my colleagues with RP who are come from like a bodybuilding or powerlifting, like basically a strength sport background. A lot of like linear periodization. Periodization is in the name of the company that I consult for, where there's not actually there's variance, but it's on a much more discrete kind of scale. Usually, and I do this for clients. I write like a 3-month, if their goal is muscle hypertrophy, then we write up a classic bodybuilding style program, like with progressive overload, and you're not really varying the movements from week to week necessarily, but you're increasing loads or maybe reps or maybe some combination thereof. But that's for a very specific goal. And that's specifically to grow muscles. And then you're reducing the variance on purpose. You're reducing the generalized adaptive potential for that program. And we see that, I think basically, I think the application is we're getting into more like a sport performance focus. I think we see that to a large degree, and athletes in our sport, who are the top games athletes, they'll take a break. If you got somebody who's maybe weaker on the strength side, but really strong on the monostructural elements, they'll purposely take a break from the running and the cycling and the rowing, and increase the weight on the barbells and do a squat cycle and a deadlift cycle or something, So, how do I get around that? I think so applying that to like my bread and butter, my interest is really in the general population and moving the needle on fitness as CrossFit defines it, and health, fitness over the lifespan. And I think I'm convinced the more, some of it was being a student of CrossFit, which is what I consider myself now, a student of the discipline, and through experience. Yeah. Like we don't necessarily need to be super meticulous in how we, slice and dice things in, each week. I'm always going to do deadlifts on Monday. Maybe I don't do heavy deadlifts, but once a month or something like that, or whatever. Like I think I've just, just through experience and the results that I've seen it achieve for the general population. I think variance I think it's awesome. So
do you think the variance component with regards to your academic peers and whatnot was such a potential point of contention? Because, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like historically speaking, maybe not in the last decade, since functional movements and high intensity are so much more en vogue than they used to be in variance as well. But historically speaking, things in the laboratory, due to the setting that you had available, there were certain things which were easier to measure than others. Hence why I think a lot of, like you said, people would lean towards endurance sports, lean towards VO2 max, lean towards things like that. And so if you were measuring something by its very nature, there wasn't going to be a high degree of variance because you couldn't measure every single solitary thing under the sun. It wouldn't work. And so you had the lifter that was looking for volume size of muscles. You had the runner that's measures VO2 max. If you had somebody else, you're like, hey, we got a new experiment coming in. Hey, what are we going to measure? Everything. You're like, what?
Everything.
How are we going to do that?
That's
not
rub.
even, A, it's not possible. B, get out of here.
Yeah, not just measure, but also experimentally manipulate and control. And that is the most difficult thing about research is, I think the reason for the rub in these conversations that you guys may have had with academics in the past, you gotta understand we're trained to think that variance is a bad thing in the sense, not just like with training, but just in general, like with the way we think and operate. Variance is the thing that you want to eliminate and reduce from your experiment. Like that's statistically, like that's, if you look at a statistics textbook, you're trying to minimize variance that's attributed to error and maximize the variance that you can explain with your experiment. So the way to mess that up and flip it on its head is to just have things kind of like, try to change a bunch of things at one time and see what happens, which, in the real world, there's no problem. In fact, the gym, with all the implements and tools and a wide open floor space and lots of people in there and a knowledgeable coach, you're actually free to tinker with things in, I don't want to say less controlled, but it is compared to like a university laboratory setting. It's okay if you like a day, like if you do an experiment, like a workout. I mean, you guys talk about it all the time. Once in a while, you program a workout that you messed up on.
Oh, sure.
Not a big deal, but you learn from it and you iterate and you move on. Iteration happens in the university setting with these experiments the way we do them, but it's on a time scale that's like archaic. It's just, it takes eons.
But necessarily because of the controls that you're trying to establish,
I think
right?
so, but in the specific context of fitness and moving the world of fitness forward, and this is where I had my biggest disconnect with there's many reasons why I'm not a university professor anymore, but we're touching on one of them. It became very, very difficult to do my job as a researcher because the field in the real world is moving so much faster than we can ever hope to keep up with at the university level. It takes from conception of the idea to publishing the paper for any experiment. If you're going fast, if you were busting your ass to try to get this done, like usually it's a doctoral student who's got their PhD, deadline on the line to get done and get out the door. You're talking about a year, and that's to understand the impact of like one kind of variable.
Variable.
So just for an example, we did an experiment looking like there was a CrossFit heavily informed and influenced study. The impact of a single Tabata workout, it was 4 different Tabatas, just quickly, rowing, dumbbell thrusters, kettlebell swings, and burpees. We put the burpees at the end, put the rowing at the beginning as a trap. And it was awesome. Yeah. Anyway, and then had the participants come in the next day, gave them a high fat meal, and looked at their ability to burn fat in that high fat meal. And spoiler alert, it was improved after the CrossFit, that Metcon. It was like a 14-hour delay between the workout and that meal. That had been shown for other types of exercise, but never with a high intensity functional training type, CrossFit style workout. And there's other forms of exercise like traditional, like stationary bike riding that took like an hour and 20 minutes of submaximal, boring, moderate and low to moderate intensity cycling to produce the same effect on the processing of that meal the next day. Okay. So anyway, I just threw that at you as I know there's a lot of information to take in, but the takeaway is that was an idea that we had back when I probably last saw you guys. I know, Boss, you were there at the 2019, I think it was, the Trainer Summit. I presented some very preliminary data from that study back then. Well, we just published that paper. I want to say it was either late 2021 or early 2022 that it actually went out in the literature. So and a pandemic happened and slowed us down during that time. However, I think we were done with data collection before that. So anyway, that's just one study. And I think about how much you learn just in real life in the gym if you're a gym owner, your programmer, your coach, you're tinkering with things all the time. Oh my gosh, it's just
you have a real life laboratory in front of you every single solitary day.
Progress, and that's why. So what I think we're getting at is why the industry has just. You look at the difference between everyday fitness, everyday working out. Now, CrossFit's not a weird thing anymore,
Right.
But our research and as like that research that I was doing was just bizarre. My colleagues didn't understand it. The IRB, the ethics committee didn't understand it. So
you wrote something really interesting as I was digging in this morning. You wrote an article for the journal that got published back in 2018. And the title is What Exercise Science Can Learn from CrossFit. And I certainly recommend everybody goes back and reads that. I found it very informative. And one of the interesting things is you kick off the article where I believe you're teaching a master's level course to your students. And it's not too long ago, it's in the recent past. And you've asked them the classic thing to define fitness. And I think it's a little bit of a joke. It winds up taking the whole class because nobody has a definition of what fitness is. And I think that's very telling and interesting in my opinion, and maybe related to some of the disconnects between academia and what happens in the real world and the gym, because you've got the science, correct me if I'm wrong here, you've got the scientists doing their very best to do good work, curious individuals, sharp individuals, trying to figure out why a certain thing occurs, right? And then we either validate it or disprove it, or we get to the bottom of it. But sometimes the question has to be asked, okay, but why does that matter, and why are you measuring it in the first place? And so if the goal would be to improve fitness, but nobody has a working definition of fitness, well, then you've identified something, but we don't even know if it drives forward the entire mission of the academic study, because we don't even know what fitness is. And so now what are we going to do with this piece of the data? And that relates in my mind back to how much, and maybe duly so, I don't know, how much weight was given to VO2 max, the gold standard, always what you heard all the time. And that may or may not improve somebody's ability in the real world to accomplish a task faster than somebody else. But if it improved VO2 max, it was deemed as this is the path. And I remember it's probably been about 10 years now, doing a level 1 seminar at a special operations unit that shall remain nameless. And they had a huge budget and took all the blood work from their operators, and they're great people, and trying to do good work. And Greg Glassman, God bless him, he's sharp-tongued. And they've got this stuff, and he shows them all this stuff, and he tells them all, the scientists tell them about all the VO2 max we have on all these operators. And Greg just says, great, what are you going to do with that data? And they're like, well, I don't know, but we have it. And he was like, what are we doing here? Like, what's the point? Like, and the point should be improving your work capacity across broad time modal domains. And it was very interesting reading your article from 2018 that even in the recent future, there wasn't a good measurable definition of fitness. And so maybe that is another challenge of the two worlds coming together from academia and then out in the, I hate to say the real world, but out in the real world.
It's very, well, I mean, there's definitely a huge difference between academia and the real world. And then the other, I think, major, I love that story, by the way, about Greg. And I've heard various iterations similar.
I cleaned it up. I cleaned up the language that was used.
I think when I visited HQ a while ago, I think you told me the real version.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
This is a family friendly podcast. Man, it's getting, I like to think it's getting better, and I can only speak based on my anecdotal experience through colleagues that I would work with. And it's not like everybody, and I had fantastic colleagues at UGA.
Sure.
And they were like, they raised an eyebrow at the stuff that I did, and that our research subjects were doing in our experiments, but they were interested and genuinely wanted to learn more about it, but they never, it's more like, I've never seen this before, but generally there's still this preoccupation with the VO2 max. And that is kind of synonymous with and a lot of times when I would ask those kids in that little thought experiment that would take an entire class period most of the time, VO2 max would come up 100%. It's like, I feel like, I don't know what the definitions are, but I feel like VO2 max has got to be in there somewhere, in so many words. That's still around, man. That's still, I would argue that's still very much like part of, because here's the thing. The original version of those textbooks that they're using now were written in the 70s. They were now in edition, like, how college textbooks are, like they just kind of revamp with new editions every couple of years. Well, now we're on like the 12th or 13th edition of the textbook that I use. When I started in 2012 or 2013, I taught from the 5th or 6th edition. And I just used that at the same time. Cause like you look at the update and it's like, well, they updated the graphics and the, but there's nothing new. So it's like, guys, just get an old version. I don't care what version you get, just get off Amazon for cheap. And, but now I think they're on like the 9th or 12th or some kind of like crazy number. And like the things that most of it hasn't really changed.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this around, where I think it's kind of interesting how people's interpretation of research matters and where it doesn't matter. I think that a lot of people get kind of sunk into this idea that I'm going to uncover some nugget and it's going to be the missing link that makes me a super athlete. I think that's where most people's hopes and dreams kind of fall when it comes to an academic approach to, doing things by the book, so to speak. And I think that that's such a subpopulation that it almost doesn't matter. It's like, fine, you have some guy who's like really invested in the gym and he wants to read all this stuff to get an edge. Cool. That's not that big of a deal in my opinion. Where I think there's a lot more kind of weirdness is how we start to get to this place where public policy is informed by, quote unquote, the science. And not to get, too far off that rails, you said this is kind of an area of your expertise and interest, but, how do we get to a state where, in the United States, the recommendations for daily exercise for the average individual are just so abysmally low and mediocre? Like I guess what I'm trying to say is that's where I see the real failing is when you have some of these isolated things that translate into real recommendations for people that end up not really serving them.
Yeah. For me, the disconnect is where, okay, so I want to try to say the important thing first. I think what I've learned over the last few years, largely through CrossFit but also lots of other areas of life. And I see this a lot in the strength world too. So let me be clear. I have a lot of colleagues that I respect a lot who are primarily, like I said, strength sports oriented powerlifters, even bodybuilders. The focus on, and you guys talked about this the other day, I think, in one of your episodes, doing hard things, right? Is what it's kind of like that key element to adherence. And this is getting into the psychological stuff. That's the nice thing, a really awesome thing about the CrossFit that focus on intensity, that discomfort. And I think there's a really significant thing about the shared experience with other people that promotes the adherence to the program. Again, we see that in any, I think let's keep it focused to like fitness and athletic endeavors. I think it applies to lots of stuff. That's really in my opinion, just some guy, but that's the main element for, if you want to, move the needle on your health and fitness for the long term, do something that makes you uncomfortable for roughly an hour every day. And that's not all of it. That's a big piece of it right there. So that's what I've learned, just kind of anecdotally, let's call it real world evidence science. That's my working conclusion. Where I think the public health aspect that you're asking about, Boz, it's just completely not even considering that as part of the calculus in its recommendations. It's it's a logic. It's just a different logic. The logic is we have a general population that is by and large completely sedentary and doing nothing. So let's just get them to start. And to get them to start, we don't want to scare them off and overwhelm them with something that's going to completely obliterate them. For example, a CrossFit class. And so the message is just do something, and here's the minimum effective dose. And it comes up. The recommendations are 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week of a moderate intensity physical activity, and that can be defined as something as simple as going for a walk for half an hour a day, walk your dog, and all that stuff. I don't disagree with the science. Don't get me wrong, and it's very clear. There's certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of research subjects who have participated in studies that produce just enormous quantities of data to support those recommendations. I don't disagree with it, but it's clearly not working because the number of people who remain sedentary or who are sedentary is if anything, it's increasing. Chronic disease isn't, last I checked, isn't getting any better at the population level. And so it's like it's a weird tension that I have. I agree with the recommendation. I 100% understand the science, but I think there's this huge piece missing, which is I think you guys touched on it at the very beginning, the psychological aspect. And it's, what is it that, okay, that's a nice recommendation, but that's not really on an individual level, which is what we really need to be, I think, focusing on, changing the health and fitness and behaviors and decisions of individuals. And that, I think that's going to be, that's a much more challenging message than the public health, the public health people that I've interacted with and the documents I've read, and just being at scientific meetings. No one, if you were to suggest, hey, look, the 30 minutes a day at a moderate intensity is that's nice, but what about 2 minutes a day at first of like maximum effort or close to it, right? No one's going to recommend that, because what about cardiovascular events? And people get concerned about that.
Sure.
Well, it turns out they're actually rare. Anyway, and it's right. That's going to hurt. It's going to be uncomfortable. They're not ever going to do it again. I don't know, man. I think, last thing before I stop rambling is there is some cool, and I can kind of look into this for you guys, and maybe from there get some recommendations for who you might talk to. There's some cool data showing, looking at like enjoyment of physical activity, and like if you look back on a session, like, did you like that, or would you do it again? And it seems like intensity is a major piece of that research. Basically, the higher intensity, the more it sucks during it, the more like kind of fondly you remember it, and higher like rating of enjoyment. There's some actual studies on that, looking at like differences between interval protocols versus continuous endurance type protocols. There's a group out of
maybe you have
Canada.
A sense of actual accomplishment because you did something challenging.
I think there's a lot to it, man. I think it would bear out with like our anecdotal experiences of like, that was sucked, but let me do it again tomorrow morning. See you at 6:30 a.m.
Yeah.
Well, if we kind of extrapolated a few things here, I think it would be useful for the listeners to just have it spelled out, like a contrast between these underlying basic recommendations, which I understand there's no disagreement there. Like, that's a great place to start. Sure, I don't think there's any disagreement. But let's take away the psychological element. Let's take away the compliance aspect. Let's pretend that we have just a human organism who will do the thing, the recommendation. what's just kind of a down and dirty compare and contrast between this kind of baseline 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week kind of recommendation versus something that's even slightly more varied? Like on a physiological level, what is the benefit to broadening that recommendation even slightly?
First thing that comes to mind is in one scenario, the follow the mainstream advice, which by the way is what I did all through grad school and my postdoc and the first couple years of my faculty position. So I can speak to this from experience. You hit a plateau real fast, like 2 weeks. You hit your plateau and then you just hang out there. At best, you're kind of treading water on your health and fitness. And if, like me, you don't pay any attention to your nutrition and you live off of, I don't know, banana bread.
I can't wait.
Then so that's a recipe for bad things to happen to body composition and health, say quality. Blood markers and everything are going to go downhill. Which again, the other thing about this is that those guidelines they actually don't even mention nutrition at all. There's another set of guidelines for those, and they have their own pitfalls.
Sure.
That's probably different
yes,
discussion.
To put it mildly, yes.
Different discussion.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, like, if you're just following that to me, I think is another reason for the lack of adherence at the population level is that, people need to see results.
Sure.
They need to see,
if you're capping out at 2 weeks, it's kind of like, okay, what's the point? Like very quickly, you reach the point of like, all right, it's not motivating anymore. Because
maybe in somebody severely deconditioned, you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks of feeling better, and like I'm not getting as winded when I carry in my groceries and that stuff. But you hit it's a pretty, pretty low ceiling for the adaptive potential. Whereas if you just vary it a little bit, which I think if I'm understanding your question right, boss, if you just do something, add in, for example, that bare minimum. I don't know. Add in a kettlebell swing or something. If you take a break every, or go to the end of the driveway and pick up that heavy boulder or whatever. I have boulders at the end of your driveway. I'm not thinking of a good example. I'm not thinking of good examples, but I think you understand. Introduce some variance and you're going to see a novel stimulus and therefore new adaptation.
Just avoid that plateau.
Yeah. So you hit that, and that's, with constant variance, really, I don't know what you guys think. There's a different way of plateauing. I think people can plateau in CrossFit after I've kind of experienced a little bit of that myself after 8 years.
Sure.
Not really hitting a lot of major PRs in CrossFit, but you can do different things, how you approach each workout and maybe tinker with some things, load up the barbell a little bit. If you're feeling a little bit afraid of the weight that day.
Yeah. And we touched on that actually in a recent episode, is because there's one of the wonderful things about variance is there's so many darn things we're trying to get good at that we could probably find something that you haven't messed around with yet. Like, I don't know if you have a press to handstand. If you don't have a press to handstand, there's a whole new thing that has a lifetime of PRs ahead of you. Start playing with that a little bit. And so it can be, it could be a very long runway. I'm not saying infinite, but vastly longer than many other protocols. That's for darn sure.
8 years in, I've got plenty to work on.
Right. Yeah. You and me both.
It'll keep me busy for a million years.
I was going to say, I'm pretty much set. I don't have much to work on these days.
You're good.
That's it. Yep.
You can retire, boss.
Yeah. On that note, unfortunately, gentlemen, I've got to leave you here. I've got a hard out this afternoon, but thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us. And I can't wait to hear the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, boss. Good to see you, man.
Take it easy, man. Too. I've only got a couple more things for you that I think you're just wonderfully suited to chat about. I'm glad you enjoyed that previous podcast. It was the 2-part about programming workouts. Because a large part of, there's so many variables in programming workouts that you want to intelligently plan for, right? Maybe when you're a novice programmer, you're stumbling through them, then the fog starts to dissipate a little bit, and you see what drives what. And then as you get more seasoned, you get a lot better at, predicting the outcome and going exactly where you want to go. And you mentioned the benefit of interval training. We talk about the metabolic pathways, and there can be this divergence potentially from academia and maybe some of the stuff that Greg used to put out, which was very grounded in science, but I don't know if the right way to say it is maybe more of a realistic approach, and I don't know if I'm wording that properly. So here's what I'm interested in is sometimes, and I'm a programming nerd, I'll see people want to program for specific metabolic pathway development. It's like, today I am only going to be in the glycolytic pathway at the exclusion of all others. And then it's the phosphocreatine, period, end of story, and nothing else. And I'm going to work these 3 metabolic pathways, and that's going to drive my fitness forward. And well, Greg would say, that's one of our supporting models of adaptation and fitness. But what if later on down the road they develop or find a fourth? I think there was that Brooks pathway, a while ago or whatnot.
Yeah.
Or a fifth or a sixth, or who cares? It's like, well, instead of being so focused on that, if you intentionally and by design go from very short to medium to long, and you make sure that you're covering those bases, you're going to get that breadth and adaptation that you should. Because also the other side of the house is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the body's almost never operating in just one metabolic pathway. Like, there's an interplay, and one might be the dominant one, but you're going to be going back and forth. So where do you see, specifically with, I guess, blending knowledge, far more knowledge than I have, that's for darn sure, of exercise science and interplay of metabolic pathways, and then the thoughts of a programmer's head? Where do you see those two worlds having a nice, symbiotic relationship?
In short, the way I think of it and understand it, it's just a nice framework for understanding time domains. I think that's the main application for the coach and the programmer. You can approximate the various time domains as being roughly equivalent to the different pathways. 30 seconds or less, you're pretty purely the phosphagen pathway. I'm just going to go off the cuff here. This isn't super clean, but 30 minutes to 2 minutes, you're predominantly glycolytic.
30 seconds to 2 minutes.
What did I say? Yeah, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And then as you get closer to 3 and then beyond, you're getting more aerobic. But even that isn't perfect, because then you got to think about okay, so let's just start with very simply for single modality exercise, that model holds up. But as soon as you start introducing you put a couplet in, and it's all different. Then you're doing a bunch of everything. And it depends on the 2 movements in a couplet, are they complementary to each other in the sense that is there interference? Right. So, yeah.
And then it can also be interesting, right? Correct my thought process if I'm wrong, is you might have one modality, like just weightlifting, but most people, because they're not cyborg robots, it's not continuous movement. So for example, the workout like DT, deadlifts, hang power cleans, and shoulder overhead, if you ran a stopwatch on somebody that did one round smooth and unbroken, let's say it takes ballpark a minute. So if you were an android, that's a 5-minute workout, but it's not a 5-minute workout. It's going to take most people 10 minutes, let's say. So even though it's one modality, there's almost a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio built into that workout. If you look at how often the athlete's working and how often they have their hands on their hips, sucking wind, going again. And so where's the, it's a very blurry field. You're
bringing me terrible flashbacks, because once in a while I like that I love that workout, but then it's a whole different flavor if you do programming as DT intervals. You're not allowed to let go of the bar. Because I like to do the thing where you pick it up, you drop it on the 11th rep, and then you pick it up on the 12th as your first. But if you
absolutely.
Anyway, there was a workout where we were doing it as intervals, and I got that. This doesn't happen to me very often anymore. We used to happen all the time, but you get that when you've gone too hard and you kind of get a panic.
Yes, sir.
It sets in. That's it's happened probably once or twice since then, but that was definitely one of the more significant. It's in my memory.
Made a mistake.
I have. Is that moment I knew?
Yes, exactly.
Probably the third of 5 rounds of that second, or even. Anyway, completely. I think painting with broad brushstrokes, this whole concept, the model of the energy systems works very well for time domains. But then if you think about it more, it because like you're saying, it doesn't necessarily hold up perfectly when you think about specific like time under tension or actually time doing the movement.
Mm-hmm.
It ends up being, I think CrossFit honestly ends up being a whole lot of glycolytic work.
Sure. Yeah.
That you just kind of you're repeatedly executing on and then recovering from. And then, and so since there's overall continuous movement, the way I think of it is that the oxidative system, the aerobic base is like, that's where it kind of, you see some people who are able to transition well and basically continuously move from one movement to the other. So for example, in the DT workout that I was describing, somebody's got, say, equal glycolytic potential as me, but has a better aerobic capacity than me. They're not panicking at the same point that I did because, they've got that kind of like, the system is sort of idling in the background, if you will.
Yeah, I was going to say, is the oxidator's role in something like that or a more developed oxidative system, shall we say, helps provide fuel a little quicker than somebody who is less developed, and therefore they can get on the bar a little faster
potentially, and then also recover from the glycolytic the bursts.
Gotcha.
To clear out all the angry, painful stuff. There's a more rapid recovery in the aerobically trained state
Gotcha.
from hard intervals like that at the muscular level. Yeah. So that's why, I'm personally right now, I'm working on a lot of spending a lot of time on the Concept 2 bike, doing a lot of running. It's interval work because I want to cover the basis of all the energy systems. But, I think if you think of the work capacity curve, I think that model works perfectly. The area of that curve is largely determined by the aerobic system. You shift that up. Let's raise it up. Elevate it through training that aerobic system. But it turns out, though, you can't just do aerobic work to do that. And
sure.
The best way to do it, in my opinion, is kind of repeated glycolytic insults, if you will, to the muscle and to the cardiovascular system. Because that's you got to sort of exceed the capacity of the aerobic system to stimulate it to adapt. And that just means you're doing glycolytic work. So,
and the wonderful thing about so many CrossFit workouts being largely glycolytic is there is that wonderful transference, to both sides of the fence from that. I mean, it is, I guess if you had to bias somewhere, it's a great place to bias. You shouldn't obviously neglect the others, but if you said you got to pick one of the three, it's like, well, I'm going to get a lot of bang for my buck out of that particular one. But I love your mention there about long work, for example, aerobic work, oxidative work, because myself, and when I program for my community and whatnot, we don't fear going running. We don't fear going long. People hate me for it, but and not at the exclusion of everything else, but realizing that training modality deserves the respect of the others, and putting it in at the appropriate frequency and volume is wonderfully beneficial to all the others. Now, if we do too much of it, yes, we can blunt the other ones. We're not looking to do that. We're looking to do it appropriately and gain that benefit, because there is so much useful area under that curve that you just said. And it's such a, sadly, in my opinion, neglected aspect these days in too many programs, where everybody just wants to lift heavy, do a short little burner workout and go home. And don't get me wrong, that's infinitely better than what the typical American is doing. You are a beast compared to the average. Now, if you're looking to maximize what you could have your fitness potential be, I would say you're leaving a lot of money on the table by not dipping your toe into those longer days. Just kind of my 2 cents. But you obviously there's science to say that makes some rational sense.
There is, man. But we're also getting into that space where you're not going to find a lot of studies. There's getting to be more and more studies that have used CrossFit methodology. But they're usually focused on like a very specific question. I would say there's a lot there's not a lot that's delving into the elements that we're talking about.
Well, that relates to another great Glassman story, which is, if you're running your gym, let's say, and you've got your 100 people or 200 people under your care, and you've had them for however long, and you're programming in the way that you program, and maybe it blends with academia or doesn't, beats me. But you're measuring everyone's points and everyone's moving in the right direction. And then you're doing it right. And Greg used to tell the story of the old salty coach on like some athletic field with his whistle around his neck, and he's been making beasts for 10 years, right? And doing his own thing, this crazy protocol. And then somebody from academia comes up with a clipboard and goes, "Hey, good news. We just proved what you're doing works." And he's like,
that's exactly how it
why
works.
did I need you to tell me that? I've been seeing it with my own eyes for a decade here.
I've got all these trophies on my wall, right?
Exactly. So
thanks.
It's an interesting deal, but there was a lot of, I was around during the going to war times and the level 1 seminars where the trainers and sometimes people in the audience would just butt heads. It didn't have to be that way, but it was every now and then.
Right.
Now that we're all more mature and those days are behind us and we're much more, friends, I think a very fair question is, what, in your opinion, what is it that maybe the larger strength and conditioning world or CrossFit in general is missing the boat on from an exercise science standpoint? There are some things you saw in CrossFit that you looked at your peers and you're like, man, we're really missing the boat on these items, and these guys seem to be doing it well. What's the other side of that coin that maybe you look at how people are working out and you're like, oh, if you would just do A, B, C, or D, you'd be better for it, but you're not?
Pat, I think it's something we haven't even talked about yet. What's the mainstream academia is missing? Movement quality. Virtuosity and movement, man. I think, and it's definitely not my expertise. I didn't learn that at the university. But that is something I found that the more, personally, the more I work on my movement, virtuosity and movement, dropping the weight and to do it well, it has lots of good things happen. Immense sort of ripple effects occur from that. But that's just not really, that's not even part of the conversations at the academic level, on a large scale. In fact, when it comes to aerobic work, which is the kind of the core element of the academic mainstream recommendations, the 30 minutes a day. This is actually, I'd say, a good thing. The emphasis is on walking and running. Just use minimal to no equipment, or use something like go for a bike ride, do something like a stationary apparatus in the gym, like stationary bike, treadmill, or elliptical. Low skill, remove the skill from the equation. Same kind of thing for strength training. If you look at the recommendations, it's used basically hit all the muscle groups, but do it with isolation movements in a traditional Globo style gym. That's what the recommended exercises are for the 2 days of strength training that they recommend. You don't see much, if anything, about squatting. There's still an argument about how deep to squat and all that stuff. Deadlifting is off the table for depending on who you ask. Obviously not in the academic strength and conditioning. There's different groups of exercise science.
Right.
I want to be really clear about this. I've got colleagues who I respect immensely and who are really doing a lot. We've learned so much more about muscle growth and how it relates to time under tension and stuff in the last, making great advances in that area. But we're talking about like the general population mainstream recommendations, this whole concept of like moving well and improving, movement patterns. You see a little bit of that in the research on older adults, kind of. There's some functional training kind of, what they call, help people getting up and down out of chairs better.
Sure.
So that's great. But the way, you walk into a CrossFit gym and the coach will sort of rebuild your movements from the ground up and have you hold the bottom of that squat or whatever the bottom is for you, and then try to get it a little bit lower with squat therapy. Man, that is just, that's super transformative. And how to get that into the universe. I don't know how you really do a study about that the way we traditionally do studies. I don't really care. I don't think we need to.
Right. I mean, it could be regaining functional range of motion, and things of that nature. But do you see anything looking the opposite way? Like, do you see anything that we as CrossFitters are missing the boat on? That academia is like,
okay,
hey, you guys should be doing this, and we're just not listening because, that's always anything which helps make us smarter and better is certainly welcome with no ego at all.
If that was your original question and I just misunderstood it, then I apologize. But
all good.
Okay. Okay. So what are CrossFitters missing the boat on from an academic standpoint? If
you were king for a day.
don't get me wrong. I don't think anything's perfect. So as much as
me neither.
But so CrossFit is, and that's one of the cool things I like about the company and the community in general. Everyone's always trying to get better.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that from an academic standpoint, I would necessarily say that there's something that, they're missing the boat on.
Don't be afraid. Don't neglect that oxidative pathway a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good one. I mean, we talked about it. I think that's a good one. I think, and I'll share this. And I was thinking about it as you were talking about it. I'm influenced not just by my background in academia and all that stuff, and my experience through CrossFit, but I happen to be married to a marathon runner who's also a CrossFit.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah. Mostly, and my wife and my mother-in-law just completed a marathon this past weekend. They do one or two of these a year, and I just let them have that most of the time. Like most I've ever run is 10K. However, I will say this: when there have been times when I've kind of run a little bit with my wife. It's been a while, but it was especially when we were dating because I wanted to get in.
Right? Yeah. I get impressed.
Yeah. It's been a little time together and stuff. That had immense benefit on my cross. And I was one of those so I started off a skeptical CrossFit before I got into it. And then once I got into CrossFit, I was one of those CrossFitters that said running is terrible. I'm never going to run again. And then through her, I did a little bit more running, and lo and behold, immense ripple effect on my fitness.
Amen to that.
And so like it's not so much the more I do, but if there's ever a time when I feel like my aerobic capacity is lacking, I'm feeling like I'm just shuffling on those 400 meter runs in a Metcon. It's like, you know what? I've been neglecting this component. Mm-hmm. And so every time I work, like I said, I'm working on it now. There's lots of reasons I'm working on it now, but that's, it's having no surprises.
It's just not popular. It's effective. It's just not popular. I mean, if you've got a 7x1 deadlift day at the gym, the parking lot's going to be full. Good luck finding a spot. If you announce that tomorrow is a 5K run, the attendance is going to be markedly different. It's just people love to avoid it, but they do it at their peril. It's profoundly beneficial.
Yeah, at our gym in particular, if you program some combination of a complex Olympic lift, like a snatch and a run together, you get the primo parking spot right there in the front.
It's funny. It's one of those things again, and not to be an entirely different podcast, but now yes, the word theoretical is in here, but Greg came up with what he believed was the theoretical hierarchy of the development of an athlete. It was a pyramid-shaped deal with sport at the top, but the base of the pyramid was metabolic conditioning. It was the base of the pyramid, your body's ability to process oxygen. We have to get that straightened out before we start doing anything. Yeah. And that seems to be what everybody wants to neglect is the base of the pyramid. It's like, well, I don't think that's going to work out too well.
Yeah. I think that's something that the community, it seems like we have the same observation, man. The community is, and I think that's the everyday gym goer for sure, but also a lot of coaches and programmers kind of, I think once in a while, what happens is people say, "Oh, Murph is coming up. We need to do a little bit more longer stuff."
Right.
But why don't we just do that kind of all the time? I mean, not like you said. I think I like how I've listened to a lot of your stuff, Pat, and I follow your work. Live your life in triplets and couplets. Go heavy about once a week. Am I getting it right? And then don't be afraid to go long.
Every now and then go long.
Every now and then go long, right? And I think that's a great recipe. Personally, I think that's a good one. So yeah, that's
I
something that
appreciate that.
people are missing out on.
Well, hopefully we can motivate people to, it's probably a good thing to close on here.
Sure.
Hopefully we can motivate people to go out and stretch their legs a little bit on a run. So
Yeah.
I just, first and foremost, maybe we can have you on again in the future, but thank you for sharing your time, your knowledge, and your expertise to hopefully benefit all the viewers and listeners.
Absolutely, Pat. I really appreciate it. Give my best to Boz. I really enjoyed it. I'll be happy to come on and chop it up with you guys anytime. I love talking about this stuff. It's the world I live in. And again, as a student of the methodology, I learn a lot from you and from your work. And so I learned a lot today as well. So I appreciate it.
I appreciate it, sir. And if somebody wants to, where can they find you on social media, or where do you want to throw out?
The easiest way to contact me is through Instagram.
Perfect.
You can find me there. Connect with me there. It should be easy to remember. Just drj.rp on Instagram.
drj.rp. Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Well, much appreciated. And as I say at the end of all these shows, if you want to help support the show, check out the show notes. Check out the VNR cycles. Boz and I are pretty proud of them. Think you guys will enjoy them. We got stuff for body weight, dumbbell, get your first strict pull up, and just hopefully things that you will find additive and beneficial to your fitness journey. So once again, for everyone watching or listening, we appreciate it. Find this episode on the btwb YouTube channel. Post your thoughts in the comments, and we read them. They help generate ideas for future shows and content. So we want to hear from you. For Adrian Bosman, for Dr. Jenkins, I'm Pat Sherwood, and we will see you next time.